France just made a move that could shake museums across the entire world. And what happened next could put pressure on every major museum in Europe. In a stunning vote, French lawmakers passed a bill by 170 to 0. Not a single person voted no. That alone tells you how historic this moment is. Because this is not just another museum policy update. That could become one of the biggest moments of historical justice of our time. We are talking about treasures taken during more than 150 years of colonial expansion. Royal treasures, sacred objects, ancient manuscripts, even items linked to China's old summer palace. But here is where this story gets even bigger. This vote may not stop with France. If France starts returning what was taken, the pressure on Britain, Belgium, Germany, and the rest of Europe could explode. And for countries like China, this may be the moment history finally starts coming home. Now here is the part almost nobody is talking about. This law does not just return one artifact. It changes the entire system. Until now, France has had a huge legal barrier. Even if an object was clearly looted during the colonial era, it was almost impossible to return. Why? Because every single item needed its own separate law. Think about how crazy that is. One object, one law. Another object, another law. That meant endless delays, political arguments, and in many cases, absolutely nothing happened. Countries could wait years and still get nowhere. That is exactly why so many disputed treasures remained locked away in French museums for decades. But this new bill changes everything. Instead of handling each object individually, France is creating a legal pathway that speeds up and streamlines the process. And this is the real turning point. Because once the system changes, thousands of objects could suddenly become eligible for return. Not one, not 10, potentially thousands. Now wait until you hear the timeline this law covers. It applies to objects acquired between 1815 and 1972. That is more than 150 years. Some of the most aggressive years of European imperial expansion fall inside that window. And during that period, the scale of removal was enormous. France is still believed to hold tens of thousands of these objects. Think about that number for a second. Tens of thousands. Every single one has a story. Every single one came from somewhere else. And every single one means something to another nation's history. But this is where the story becomes especially emotional for China. Many people still remember one of the darkest chapters in modern Chinese history. The Old Summer Palace. In 1860, during the Second Opium War, Anglo-French forces looted and burned the Imperial Palace complex in Beijing. It was one of the greatest acts of cultural destruction in modern history. Porcelain, jade, bronze works, clocks, scrolls, furniture, ceremonial treasures. Countless imperial objects were taken. Some entered museums. Some disappeared into private collections. Some were sold repeatedly across generations. For many Chinese viewers, it is not distant history. It is still an open wound. And that is why one question now becomes impossible to ignore. Could Chinese treasures finally be included? That question alone is why this story has such massive global potential. Because it is not just about museums. It is about justice. It is about history. And this is about whether Europe is finally being forced to confront what it took to get there. But then the story takes another surprising turn. During the parliamentary debate, one French lawmaker invoked the words of Victor Hugo. And that moment has caught huge attention online. Why? Because Victor Hugo himself condemned the looting of China during the destruction of Yuanmingyuan more than a century ago. Now imagine that. A moral argument made over 100 years ago is now being used in modern legislation. That transforms this from a legal story into something much bigger. A civilizational reckoning. a nation looking back at its own past and asking difficult questions. But here is the next twist. It did not happen overnight. The roots of this moment go back almost a decade. In 2017, Emmanuel Macron delivered a speech in Burkina Faso that shocked many Europeans. He openly said African heritage should not remain locked away in European museums forever. At the time, many dismissed it as political theater. Just another speech. Just another promise. But now, nearly 9 years later, that promise is turning into law. And that is what makes this moment so powerful. It is not an isolated vote. It is the result of years of political change. And it reflects something much larger happening across Europe. France, Britain, Belgium, Germany. Across the continent, colonial history is being re-examined. Questions once considered too uncomfortable are now becoming mainstream. Who really owns these artifacts? Were they legally purchased? Were they seized under military occupation? Can colonial conquest ever create legitimate ownership? These questions are no longer academic. They are now shaping laws. And France may have just moved ahead of the rest of Europe. Which leads to the biggest turning point of all. What happens next? Once one major European power opens a legal path to restitution, others may face enormous pressure. Imagine renewed scrutiny on the British Museum. Imagine pressure over Chinese imperial artifacts, Egyptian relics, Greek marbles, African royal treasures. It could trigger a domino effect across Europe. And that is not an exaggeration. Once legal frameworks are in place, the pace of returns can accelerate dramatically. Museums that once relied on delay may no longer have that shield. And governments seeking restitution now have a much stronger argument. France did it. Why not you? That question may soon be directed at London, Brussels, Berlin, and beyond. But there is one more important twist. The law is not fully finished yet. It still needs final legislative steps through the Senate and reconciliation of amendments. So this is a huge breakthrough. But not the final chapter. Still, politically, the hardest part may already be over. Because once the lower house passes something unanimously, reversing that momentum becomes extremely difficult. For China, this could become a major diplomatic opportunity. If finalized, Beijing may be able to pursue specific claims tied to war, forced removal, and colonial intervention. That does not mean everything comes back overnight. Every claim will still need evidence, documentation, formal legal review. But the door is now more open than it has been in decades. And that alone makes this a historic turning point. Because in the end, this is about more than objects. People do not just see museum pieces. They see memory, identity, civilization, a nation's soul. And if this becomes the beginning of a wider European chain reaction, then this story will not just be about France. It may be about the future of history itself.